My father-in-law once sat me down and told me that you can tell everything you need to know about a man by looking at his bank account. He didn't whisper it either. He said it loud and clear during Thanksgiving dinner, right in front of my wife and her entire family. They all had a good laugh, acting like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. I didn't say a word. I just kept my head down and focused on cutting my turkey, trying to ignore that sharp, stinging pain in my chest. For 8 long years, I let that man believe I didn't have a dime to my name. I sat there and took every single jab, every mean-spirited comment, and every look of disgust from people who thought they were better than me just because they lived in mansions and drove cars that cost more than my house. I kept telling myself it didn't matter. I figured love was plenty, and that as long as my wife saw who I really was, her family's opinion didn't mean squat. Man, I was wrong about a lot of things back then. But on Christmas night, sitting in the fanciest restaurant in the city in front of 40 strangers, my father-in-law was about to get a serious reality check. My name is Silas Julian. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 10 years, I've made my living restoring old furniture. I'm the guy who takes something broken and makes it whole again. I fix up antique dressers with cracked wood, rocking chairs that have been in families for generations, and dining tables that have seen decades of holiday meals. People trust me with their most precious memories, and I use my own 2 hands to bring those memories back to life. It's honest, good work. But to the Thornberrys, my wife's family, that work meant I was a nobody. I met my wife, Margot, 9 years ago at a local county fair. She was different back then. She had this easy laugh and didn't care one bit that I drove a beat-up truck or bought my clothes at second-hand shops. She used to tell me she loved my hands and the way I could create beauty out of a pile of junk. We got married 2 years later at the courthouse. A real simple ceremony. Her parents barely even showed up. Her dad, Julian, looked at me like I was something unpleasant he'd stepped in, and her mom, Beatrice, just gave me this fake, polite smile that couldn't hide the judgment in her eyes. I really thought things would get better. I thought once they saw how much I cared for their daughter, they'd eventually accept me into the fold. But that never happened. Julian Sterling owns 4 major car dealerships in the state. He's a loud, wealthy guy who made it his life's mission to remind me at every single holiday that I wasn't good enough to be in his family. Beatrice was quieter, but she was just as mean. She'd wrap her insults in a layer of fake concern that felt like silk but cut like a blade. Then there's their son, Arthur. He's 29 and has never broken a sweat a day in his life. Yet he thinks he's got the right to make fun of me for actually working for a living. I put up with it for 8 years. I worked hard, kept my mouth shut, and hoped Margot would stand by my side. But she started changing. It was slow at first, then it happened all at once. She stopped sticking up for me. She stopped looking at me the way she used to. By the end, I was living with a woman who seemed totally embarrassed that I even existed. The only real family I ever had was my mom, who passed away when I was 25, and her brother, my Uncle Gideon. Gideon was a quiet soul who lived in a small cabin out in the woods. He wore flannel shirts, old work boots, and drove a truck that looked even worse than mine. When I turned 18, he gave me something I didn't quite understand at the time. It was a matte black card. No logos, no bank names, nothing on it but a name etched in silver, Gideon Marsh. He told me to keep it on me at all times, but warned me never to use it unless I was truly backed into a corner. Then he told me something I've remembered for 16 years. He said, "Owen, when you finally do use this, they're going to find out exactly who you are." I had no idea what he meant. I asked him about it, but he just smiled and told me I'd understand when the time was right. Uncle Gideon passed away 3 years ago, and I still hadn't touched that card. I just kept it in my wallet as a way to keep a piece of him with me every day. That brings us back to Christmas night. I was sitting at a massive table at a place called the Winthrop, surrounded by the entire Sterling clan. 42 people all there because of Julian's money, and all of them looking at me like I was a mistake. That's when my wife reached into her bag, pulled out a legal envelope, and slid it across the white tablecloth toward me. It was the divorce papers, already signed and dated 2 weeks ago. Her father stood up, raised his glass, and told the whole room that I'd be out on the street by February. The entire table started clapping and cheering. 40 people celebrating my life falling apart on Christmas night. I sat there for a second, feeling the weight of every single insult and every time they made me feel like blow. Then I reached into my wallet and pulled out that black card from 16 years ago. I handed it to the waiter. He took one look at the name, and the color drained right out of his face. He leaned down and whispered just 5 words that turned that noisy room dead silent. This is the story of how I stopped being invisible. This is the night everything changed. But I need to take you back a little further so you can see how I ended up at that table, holding divorce papers and surrounded by people who resented me. I grew up in a tiny house with my mom, Clara. She worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and she taught me that having a good heart and working hard was worth more than a mountain of gold. When she passed, it almost devastated me. The only thing that kept me standing was Uncle Gideon. Gideon Marsh was a man who didn't say much. He lived alone in that cabin about an hour from the city, surrounded by the quiet of the forest. He dressed just like I do, flannels and jeans that had seen some miles. He drove a truck that rattled so loud you could hear him coming from a mile away, and he didn't care what a single soul thought of him. I spent my summers with him as a kid. He's the one who taught me how to work with wood, how to sand it until it felt like glass, and how to see the potential in something most people would throw away. He gave me my career, and on my 18th birthday, he gave me that card. I remember how heavy it felt in my hand. It wasn't plastic. It felt solid, strange, and expensive. No numbers, no bank name, just Gideon Marsh in silver. He looked at me with those wise eyes and told me to hold on to it until I truly needed it. I pressed him for answers, but he just gave me that smile and said the time would come. I carried that card for 16 years. After he passed, I held on to it even tighter. It was the last thing I had left of him. Now, I've got to tell you a bit more about Margot. When we first met at that fair 9 years ago, I honestly felt like I'd hit the jackpot. She was gorgeous, sure, but she was also kind, and she had this laugh that could make all the noise in the world just fade away. We stood by the Ferris wheel that first night and talked for hours. She told me she'd never met a guy like me. Someone real, someone who actually worked with his hands. She said she was tired of the suit and tie types her parents were always trying to shove down her throat. We fell hard, and we fell fast. Maybe too fast, looking back. We were married within 2 years. I didn't have a big savings account to offer her, but I gave her my word that I'd love her, support her, and be her rock through thick and thin. And I meant every single syllable of it. From day one, her family made it crystal clear they wanted nothing to do with me. The first time I met Julian Sterling, he asked me what I did for a living. I told him I restored antique furniture, and he just let out this dry laugh. "Oh, so you're a handyman," he said. He didn't even wait for me to explain before he turned his back on me. His wife, Beatrice, was a different kind of mean. She'd smile and say, "How charming," but she said it in a way that made the word feel like a slap in the face. Later on, Margot told me her mom had pulled her aside to ask if she was really sure about marrying me. Back then, Margot was furious. She told me she didn't care about their money or their opinions. She loved me for who I was. That was the woman I married. That was the Margot I would have done anything for. But families like that, they have a way of grinding you down over time. Year after year, holiday after holiday, the insults just kept stacking up. Julian never missed a chance to point out that I wasn't a real provider. Beatrice would constantly talk about her friends' sons-in-law, the doctors, the big-shot lawyers, the executives, and then she'd look at me with this fake pity that made my skin crawl. Even her brother Arthur got in on it, calling me the repairman, like it was some big inside joke that I wasn't supposed to get. Slowly, but surely, Margot stopped having my back. In the beginning, she'd reach under the table and squeeze my hand when her dad started acting up. She'd tell me later she was sorry and that she knew I was worth 100 of them. But then, the hand-squeezing stopped. Then, the apologies stopped. Eventually, she started looking at me with that same cold judgment I saw in her parents' eyes. By the time we hit our 6th anniversary, I felt like a ghost in my own house. We barely talked. She spent more time hanging out with her family than she did with me. Every time I tried to ask what was going on, she'd just brush me off and walk out of the room. I tried working even harder, taking on every extra project that came my way. I thought if I could just make a little more money, if I could prove I was a success, maybe things would go back to the way they were. It didn't work. The night before Christmas Eve, I walked into the hallway and caught Margot on the phone with her mother. I heard her say, "I know, Mom. I should have listened to you from the start." She didn't see me standing there. She had no idea I heard her admit our whole life was a mistake. I went to bed that night feeling like I was standing on a ledge, just waiting for the final shove. The next evening, we drove to the Winthrop restaurant in total silence. Margot was decked out in a red dress and diamond earrings her father bought her. I wore my one good shirt, the one I kept for the rare times I had to pretend I fit into her high society world. I had no clue that in less than 2 hours, my entire life was going to get flipped upside down. The Winthrop is one of those places that makes you feel like you don't belong the second you step inside. Giant crystal chandeliers, marble floors that shine like glass, and waiters in fancy suits moving around like silent shadows. I've never felt comfortable in places like that, and walking in there that night was no exception. Julian had booked a private room for the big Sterling Christmas bash. When we walked in, the table was already packed with 42 people, a whole swarm of aunts, uncles, cousins, and business partners. Everyone there was tied to Julian's wallet in one way or another. Julian sat at the head of the table like a king on a throne. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than I make in 3 months of hard labor. Beatrice sat next to him in her pearls, sporting a smile that looked sharp enough to draw blood. Then there was Arthur, slumped in his chair with a glass of expensive drink, looking bored out of his mind. Margot didn't even wait for me. She walked straight to the front and sat by her mom. I followed along and took the empty seat next to her, nodding to the relatives who bothered to look my way. Most of them just ignored me like I was part of the furniture. I was used to it. The dinner started with the usual rich people small talk. They bragged about trips to Europe, their new cars, and how their stocks were doing. One cousin's kid got into Harvard. Another was marrying some hedge fund manager. The conversation just flowed around me like water around a rock. I sat there in total silence, cutting my food into tiny pieces I couldn't even taste. Then Julian decided it was time to play with his food. "So, Owen," he said, loud enough to make sure every head at the table turned our way. "How's the chair business? You fix anything exciting lately?" A few people started snickering. I forced myself to stay calm and gave him a small smile. "It's been a good year, Julian. The work is steady." Julian leaned back, swirling his wine like a movie villain. "Steady. That's just a fancy way of saying you're barely making rent, right? You know, I was talking to Desmond Huxley last week. You remember Desmond, don't you, Margot? The surgeon. He just picked up a place in the hills. $4 million, cash." He looked at me with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "What did you buy this year, Owen? A new bag of sandpaper?" The whole table burst out laughing. I felt my face get hot, but I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I'd learned a long time ago that getting mad just makes people like that happy. Beatrice leaned in with that practiced, fake sweet smile of hers. "We aren't trying to be mean, Owen. We're just worried about Margot's future. A woman needs to feel secure. I'm sure you can understand that." Oh, I understood. She was telling me I was a failure, and that I'd always be a failure in their eyes. Arthur raised his glass at me, mocking me in front of everyone. "Hey, look on the bright side. At least he's consistent. Consistently broke." More laughter followed, louder than before. I just gripped my fork and stared at my plate, waiting for the storm to pass. I kept telling myself to breathe. I just had to stay calm. In my head, I was counting down the minutes until I could get out of there, go home, and try to forget this nightmare ever happened. But then Margot reached into her purse. She pulled out a plain white envelope and slid it across the table toward me. Her face was like a stone, totally blank. She wouldn't even meet my eyes. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it," she said, her voice cold. I picked it up and broke the seal. Inside was a thick stack of legal papers. I didn't even have to get past the first page to know what I was looking at. It was a petition for divorce. My hands started to shake. I looked at Margot, searching for any trace of the woman I'd married, but she was gone. "You're doing this? On Christmas?" I managed to say. She still wouldn't look at me. "I've made up my mind, Owen. I should have done this a long time ago. My father was right about you. You're never going to be anything." Those words hit me like a physical punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs. I couldn't even think straight. Right then, Julian struck his hand on the table, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "Finally," he barked, "my daughter has finally come to her senses." He hoisted his wine glass high in the air. Owen, I'll give you until February to pack your junk and get out of the house. After that, you're on the street where you belong. Homeless by February. Man, that's got a nice ring to it, doesn't it? He turned to the rest of the table with a theatrical wave. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a toast to Margot's freedom. Suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of 42 people clapping and cheering. They were celebrating my life being torn apart right there on Christmas night. I sat there, frozen, watching my marriage die to the sound of a standing ovation. My wife was silent, my father-in-law was howling with laughter, and the rest of them were applauding my humiliation. And that's when something inside me just snapped. I thought about every single insult I'd swallowed over the last 8 years. I thought about all those nights I stayed quiet just to keep the peace, wondering why I wasn't good enough for these people. Then I thought about Uncle Gideon. I thought about those words he told me 16 years ago. When you use it, they'll know exactly who you are. For the first time in 8 years, I decided I was done being invisible. The clapping eventually passed down, but my ears were still ringing. I looked around at all those faces, people who saw me as nothing more than a mistake Margot had made. They were already moving on, pouring more wine and chatting like I wasn't even there. To them, I was already a memory. Margot was whispering to her mom about moving back into the family estate. Arthur was laughing at something on his phone. Julian was soaking up congratulations like he'd just closed a billion-dollar merger. I carefully folded those divorce papers and tucked them into my jacket pocket. My hands weren't shaking anymore. A strange, cold clarity washed over me. I wasn't even angry or sad anymore. I was just finished. A young waiter started working his way down our end of the table, clearing away empty plates. I raised my hand to flag him down. "Excuse me," I said. He stopped and gave me a professional nod. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "I'd like to take care of the bill," I told him. "The whole table. Every single person." The waiter blinked, his professional mask slipping for a second. "Sir, there are 42 guests here. The total is going to be, it's going to be several $1,000s at least." I just nodded. "I understand perfectly." Julian's voice cut through the air like a jagged blade. "What are you playing at, Owen?" I didn't even look at him. I kept my eyes locked on the waiter. Julian let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Did you guys hear that? Silas wants to pay for dinner. The guy who glues broken chairs for a living wants to pick up a tab that's probably more than he makes in half a year." The table erupted again. Arthur nearly choked on his drink. "Maybe he's going to offer to wash the dishes to pay it off," he shouted. Beatrice shook her head with that fake, sugary sympathy. "Owen, honey, don't embarrass yourself any more than you already have. We know what your situation is." Margot finally looked at me, but she just looked annoyed. "Owen, stop it. This is pitiful. You're just making a scene for no reason." I didn't say a word. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my old, worn-out leather wallet. I opened it up and found that matte black card sitting right where it had been for 16 years, tucked behind my license. I pulled it out and felt the weight of it. It felt like the answer to every question I'd ever had. I handed it to the waiter. "Use this." The waiter took it with a practiced hand, glancing at it the way he'd look at any other card. But then he stopped dead. His eyes went wide and every bit of color drained out of his face. He looked at the card, then at me, then back at the card. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. "Is there a problem?" I asked calmly. The waiter swallowed hard. "Sir, please excuse me for just one moment. I need to go speak with my manager." He turned on his heel and practically ran toward a private door at the end of the dining room. Julian snorted. "Well, there you go. Cards probably declined or expired. Do you even have a credit limit, Owen? Or did the bank laugh you out of the lobby?" I didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. I just sat there with my hands folded and waited. 2 minutes went by. The chatter at the table started back up, but I could see people stealing glances at me, wondering what was taking so long. Then the door opened. The waiter came out first, walking with a sense of urgency. Behind him was an older gentleman in a flawless charcoal suit. He moved with the kind of authority that commanded a room, but he had a look on his face I'd never seen directed at me before. It was pure, unadulterated respect. His name tag said Mr. Blackwood, general manager. He walked straight past Julian, straight past Margot, and came right to me. "Mr. Julian?" he asked. I stood up and shook his hand. "That's me." Mr. Blackwood's voice was as smooth as silk, but it carried a warmth that definitely wasn't there before. "Sir, please accept my sincerest apologies," he said. "We had no clue you'd be joining us tonight. If we'd had even a heads up, we would have made much better arrangements for your arrival." Julian leaned forward, his smug little grin starting to wobble. "What the heck is going on here? Who do you think you're talking to?" Mr. Blackwood didn't even glance at him. He kept his eyes locked on mine. "Mr. Julian, we've been in touch with the estate's legal team, and they've confirmed everything. Your uncle's instructions were very specific. The second you presented that card, we were to trigger all the protocols immediately." My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I kept my cool. "What protocols are we talking about?" Mr. Blackwood leaned in a little closer. By now, the entire table had gone dead silent. 42 people were staring at us like we were the only 2 people in the world. He spoke quietly, but in that silence, every word rang out like a bell. "Sir, your uncle founded this entire company. He owned it outright, and when he passed 3 years ago, full ownership was transferred to you." He paused, looking me square in the eye. "Mr. Julian, you own this entire restaurant." I have never heard a silence like the one that followed. It wasn't just quiet. It felt like the air had turned to ice. I watched the realization hit that table like a physical shockwave. Julian's champagne glass stopped halfway to his face, his mouth hanging open in total disbelief. Beatrice's perfect face finally cracked, her eyes darting around like she was waiting for someone to jump out and say it was all a prank. Arthur looked like he'd been slapped. His expensive phone slipped right out of his hand and thudded onto the table. And then there was Margot. My wife, the woman who'd handed me divorce papers 10 minutes ago, was staring at me like I was a complete stranger. Mr. Blackwood kept going, totally unaware of the carnage his words were causing. "Mr. Julian, your uncle, Gideon Marsh, started Marsh Hospitality 42 years ago. He turned a single diner into one of the biggest luxury groups in the country. The Winthrop is our crown jewel, but the group owns 37 restaurants and 12 five-star hotels across the states. Your uncle stayed out of the spotlight for decades, but he kept every bit of the company until he passed." I finally found my breath. I had no idea about any of this. Mr. Blackwood nodded. "That was the plan, sir. Your uncle left very strict orders with his lawyers. He wanted you to live a normal life, without the weight of all that money, until you were truly ready. The black card was the key. He said that when you finally pulled it out, it would mean you were ready to step up and take what's yours." Julian suddenly struck his hand on the table so hard the forks rattled. "This is a joke. This is some kind of sick prank. Silas is a nobody. He glues chair legs together in a rented garage. There is no way on earth he owns a single thing." Mr. Blackwood turned to Julian with a look of icy, professional politeness. "Sir, I can promise you our legal department has verified Mr. Julian's identity and his claim to the Marsh estate down to the last signature. Every document is ironclad. Mr. Silas Julian is the 100% owner of Marsh Hospitality Group and everything under it." He paused for effect. "As of this morning's valuation, his net worth is north of $400 million. That number hit the room like a grenade. $400 million. I watched faces transform right before my eyes. Relatives who hadn't even nodded at me all night were now staring with wide, hungry eyes. The cousins who'd been laughing at Arthur's jokes looked like they were about to be sick. Beatrice had her hand over her heart like she was faint, and Arthur grabbed his drink and struck the whole thing back in one gulp. Then Margot's voice cut through the quiet, thin, shaky, and small. "Owen, why didn't you tell me? All these years, why didn't you say something?" I looked at her. I really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. I saw the woman who'd handed me a divorce on Christmas without a single tear. I saw the woman who sat back and watched her family pick me apart for a decade. I saw the woman who told me I'd never be anything. "I didn't know, Margot," I said softly. "But let me ask you, would it have mattered? You gave me those papers because you thought I was worthless. Your family has spent 8 years treating me like the dirt on their boots. None of you ever saw me. You only saw what I didn't have. She tried to say something, but the words just wouldn't come out. I stood up and pushed my chair back. "I loved you," I said. "I would have given you every single thing I had. It wasn't much, but it was real. I would have worked myself to the bone just to see you smile. But you chose to walk away the second you thought I had nothing left to offer. That tells me everything I'll ever need to know about what our marriage meant to you." I turned my attention to Julian. His face had gone from bright red to a ghostly white, and he was sweating through his expensive suit. "You told me I'd be homeless by February, right?" I asked. "That's funny, Julian, because according to the records Mr. Blackwood's team just pulled up, Marsh Properties owns the lease on the building where your dealership headquarters sits. Which means I'm your landlord." Julian's jaw tightened so hard I thought it might snap. He couldn't say a word. "So, let's be clear," I continued. "You'll be moving out of that building by February. Think of it as a little parting gift from the nobody who fixes chairs for a living." I grabbed my coat off the chair and slipped it on. "Mr. Blackwood, send the bill for tonight to my office. The whole dinner is on me. Consider it my final gift to the Thornberrys, a little reminder of the man they thought wasn't worth their time." I turned around and headed for the door. I heard Margot call my name, heard her chair scrape against the floor as she jumped up. I felt her hand reach out to grab my arm. I didn't even slow down. At the door, I stopped and looked back one last time. 42 faces were staring at me, frozen in a mix of pure shock and total disbelief. "My uncle once told me that you can't measure a man's worth by the thickness of his wallet," I said, my voice steady. "He said you measure it by how he treats people when he thinks nobody important is watching. Tonight, I watched every single one of you. And now I know exactly what you're worth." I turned my back and walked out into the cold December night. The snow was falling light and soft, turning the city into a sea of white. The air felt sharp and clean, and for the first time in 8 years, I could actually breathe. I didn't look back once. The days following that dinner were some of the quietest of my life. I went back to the small house I'd shared with Margot, packed a single suitcase, and was gone before she even walked through the door. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to hear her excuses or her "I'm sorries." I just wanted to close that book and start a brand new chapter. The divorce actually went through a lot faster than I expected. At first, Margot's lawyers tried to put up a fight. They claimed she didn't know about my money and that she deserved a massive chunk of the estate. But man, talk about irony. See, her father had insisted on a rock-solid prenuptial agreement years ago to protect the sterling fortune from a guy like me. Well, that paper worked perfectly, just in reverse. Since everything I inherited was outside of the marriage, Margot walked away with exactly what she planned to leave me with. Absolutely nothing. I heard through the grapevine that Julian's dealership lost its lease about 3 months later. I didn't renew it. I didn't do it because I was being petty or looking for revenge. I just felt zero obligation to keep doing business with a man who spent 10 years trying to ruin me. He had to move his headquarters to a tiny lot on the edge of town, and within a year, half his locations were shuttered for good. The man who mocked me for fixing chairs was now watching his own empire crumble to dust. About 6 months later, I got a letter from Beatrice. 3 pages of apologies, explanations, and invitations to grab a coffee and start over. She claimed she'd always liked me and that Julian was the only one with the problem. I read it once, folded it up, and tossed it right in the blow. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, they're meant to be burned. Even Arthur tried to reach out. He hit me up on social media, acting all friendly like we were old buddies. He mentioned some business ideas he had and wondered if I could help him get them off the ground. I blocked his number without even typing a reply. I spent 8 years watching that kid do nothing for anyone but himself. I wasn't about to start bankrolling his lazy lifestyle now. Then, late one Tuesday night, Margot called. Her voice sounded broken. Nothing like the cold, hard woman who had slid those papers across the table. She told me she'd made a huge mistake. She said she didn't realize what she had, that she still loved me, and she begged for another chance. I let her finish. Then I told her the tea Clara. "You had everything, Margot," I said. "You had a husband who truly loved you and would have moved mountains for you. That was worth more than any amount of money, but you couldn't see it then, and I can't unsee the way you looked at me when you thought I was nothing." I hung up, and I haven't spoken to her since. I took over the day-to-day at Marsh Hospitality, but I didn't do it from some fancy corner office. I started visiting the restaurants and walking through the hotels. I made it a point to learn the names of the people who actually make the place run. The chefs, the housekeepers, the valets. I ask about their families and I remember their birthdays. I'm trying to be the kind of leader Uncle Gideon would have been proud of. I still spend my weekends in my workshop, too. I kept my tools and I still take on restoration projects when I can. It keeps me grounded. It reminds me of who I was before the money and who I still want to be. About a year after that Christmas dinner, I was sanding down an old oak table when I found something I hadn't noticed before. There was a tiny hidden drawer in the back, stuck tight. I pried it open and found a yellowed envelope inside. It was a letter from Uncle Gideon, written years before he passed. My hands were shaking as I read his words. "Owen, if you're reading this, it means you finally used the card. I never told you about the money because I wanted you to become a good man on your own terms. Anyone can be kind when they're rich, but the real test is how you treat people when you have nothing. You pass that test every single day. I watched you work hard, stay humble, and love people without asking for anything in return. That's why I left it all to you. Not because you needed it, but because you deserved it. Stay good, son. And remember, the people who love you when you have nothing are the only ones worth keeping when you have everything. Love, Uncle Gideon." I sat in that workshop for a long time, just letting those words sink in. For 8 years, I let people convince me I was worthless. I believed them because I thought worth was about bank accounts and titles. But Uncle Gideon knew the T-Clara. Worth is about character. It's about showing up and treating people with dignity, even when no one is watching. That Christmas dinner changed my life. Not because I got rich, but because I realized the people mocking me were the ones who were truly poor. They had the money, sure, but they had no heart, no loyalty, and no real love. If you're out there right now feeling invisible or like the world has counted you out, I want you to hear me. Your worth isn't decided by the people who underestimate you. Keep your head up. Stay true to yourself. Your moment is coming. And when it gets here, make sure you're still the person who deserves it.